In this video, we'll look at how you can make your subroutines and functions more flexible by defining arguments or parameters. Arguments enable you to have the same function perform slightly differently based on the values which are passed during the function call or subroutine call. If we look at the subroutine calls that we've done so far, for example, this one which creates a document, however many times we call that subroutine, it's always going to do the same thing. It will always insert a title with that specific piece of text. Simply by defining an argument for this subroutine, we can have the same subroutine, create a new document, but place a different title inside it each time. In a similar way, this subroutine, when called, will always create a table which has exactly 2 rows and 5 columns. If we define 2 parameters to control the number of rows and the number of columns, we can call the same subroutine but end up with a different table each time. Let's look at how this works. To save some time, we'll copy this subroutine and this function, and just paste it below the originals and then rename. So this will be 3a, 3b, and 3b. And the element which we want to replace with an argument is this title. To define an argument, and arguments are also known as parameters, inside the parentheses which follow the name of the function or subroutine, you specify the name of your parameter or argument, and we can use the same naming conventions that we've been using for variables, which is essentially what arguments are. So this is obviously text, str title as string. So it's exactly the same as declaring a variable, with the exception that we don't use the keyword dim. And of course, this text is then replaced by str title. Now when we call the function, we can specify, in fact we must specify, a string value which will end up inside this parameter or variable. So in parentheses, we just paste in the title that we had before. So you can see how this process works. If we needed to create several new documents, we could use this syntax repeatedly, but enter a different title each time within the parentheses. Let's do the same for the creation of the table. So let's copy the subroutine that creates the table, which is here. And just rename that 3. So the parameters we want are to replace that fixed integer and that fixed integer. So we'll call them int rows as integer, int cols as integer, and then of course here we use int rows and here int cols. So I'll just copy the name of the function, or rather subroutine, and then here we can place call and paste. Then in parentheses, after the name of the subroutine, you'll see that the program is actually prompting us to enter int rows as integer and int cols as integer. So we had 2, and 4. And let's just test that we get the same results as before. So let's save our changes and then run our macro. So here we can see one of the dangers of using copy and paste. You always have to remember to make the necessary changes to what you paste. And of course, what we've done here is we've left the old name. So on returning a value, we've used the wrong name. So we just need to reset and modify the name accordingly. Let's run again. and we can see that we get our new document with the title and the table. So with the small amount of code that we have so far, we're not saving a huge amount of time, but this structure is very powerful because it means you can reuse the functions and the subroutines that your macro needs and get slightly different results by creating parameters to have the subroutine or function behave slightly differently, perform slightly different actions. So it makes your code even more reusable, even more flexible, even more modular. Arguments, also known as parameters, are variables used to make subroutine calls more flexible. To define arguments, use the syntax argument name 1 as data type 1, argument name 2 as data type 2, etc., in parentheses after the name of the subprocedure. When calling a subroutine or function with defined arguments, a value of the appropriate data type must be supplied for each argument, using the syntax call procedure name, argument value 1, comma, argument value 2, comma, etc.